Well, we're going to have a conversation, and this is going to be a little longer than the others, so we'll move the chairs to the front, and I think there are microphones there. When they're settled, I actually have some questions to start us off. Maybe another round of applause while they're getting settled, because it was a great presentation. A question I'd like to explore is that so often when we talk about the protocols put in place to protect people from misuse of data, we know down the road that there's going to be a breach of some kind. Should there be protocols preparing people for the misuse of data from the beginning? Let's start with Dr. Garrison.
So there probably could be protocols in place, and some tribes do have tribal IRBs, like Navajo Nation has a tribal IRB in place where they have a lot of protections around how the data are used. They require quarterly research reports, and a lot of other tribes are starting to model their tribal IRBs after those kinds of models. And so I think that helps to protect the tribe up front. But I think one of the other challenges and problems is actually that there aren't enough penalties in place or things that are in place that would penalize researchers if they misuse samples, or the idea of blacklisting a researcher sounds like it might help, but in reality that doesn't necessarily affect change. And so I think that there's still a lot that can be done on that side of the coin.
I'm just curious about if there's thoughts about how to prepare someone for the absolute certainty that something bad is going to happen at some point.
Well, I mean, certainly in terms of like the educational process, when we look at putting in place a research system, I mean, we talk about, breaches of confidentiality, we talk about violations of protocols, and we try to, encourage enough oversight to make sure that it's probably not going to happen. And I think that most communities, I mean, most communities understand risk. I mean, they're going out and doing very sophisticated. Tribes are doing very sophisticated things. Maybe not in the area of genetic research, but in the area of environmental sciences and natural resources management. And they're on the cutting edge of some economic endeavors because they have to be, because they're not able to generate income from taxation. So they've got to generate it from economic development. And so we've seen amazing creativity and risk-taking by tribes. They understand it. But especially in the area of genetic research, I mean, it takes a little bit of education because it's not something that people intuitively understand what the risks are. I mean, I certainly don't fully understand all the risks. I'm constantly talking to geneticists, and something that seems simple when I say it, then all of a sudden they sort of string off all the reasons why, yeah, but you need to learn this, and you need to know this, and all of these things that I didn't understand. And so there does need to be a lot of community education, I think, before a tribe or any Indian organization jumps into a specific genetic research project. They need to really vet what could possibly be the unforeseen consequences, or what are the things that I don't fully understand that a geneticist may, but I don't understand is a potential risk. And over time, as you start out hopefully small with a lower risk project, and you put in place those things that a tribe can put in place to protect them. Contracts, I love contracts, I'm a lawyer. So, put it on paper, create dispute resolution projects, specifically state what the scope of the project is, specifically state who owns the data, specifically state what the process is to get a data sharing approved. Tribes aren't necessarily opposed blanket to data sharing. What they're concerned about is sharing for some use that hasn't been approved. What's the system for approving both publications from this study as well as future study using data collected from the instant study down the road. All of those things should be discussed, vetted, and put down in writing ahead of time, and I think that really serves to minimize that risk.
Maybe this is a twist on the same question, but I write about social media a lot, and with social media, people voluntarily give out extraordinary amounts of information, very personal information. What if individuals don't bother with the tribe and start selling on their own private information that could have a larger impact?
Well, a tribal member? I think you'd probably see it criminalized in the tribal code, and they would be charged by their tribe with a crime, or they'd be civilly fined. Tribes have the ability to do that. And if you did that, then you would see tribes pushing the extent of their sovereignty to reach out to try to stop those actions. If it occurs on the reservation, then the tribe has a whole bunch of avenues. They can exclude anybody, non-Indian or otherwise, from the reservation. And they also can work strongly with the IRBs within their sort of sphere of influence. The Indian Health Service IRBs and the area IRBs, Alaska IRBs, been very good about working with and for its communities to be able to regulate those kind of things. And so tribes are learning those avenues, but those are the avenues that I would think would be used.
Well, I think I thought about this from the context of the Personal Genome Project and other large projects like that, where there are very few Native Americans included in those types of projects, and I don't know what those discussions were like with individuals with the researchers, but from my own perspective, I also would hesitate very much to want to put my genomic information out in a public domain, because that would have implications for my family members as well, and would have implications for my tribe. The Navajo Nation also has a moratorium on genetic research studies within the territorial jurisdiction of the Navajo Nation. And what that means in the context of a personal genome project, where one can argue that's research or that's not research, I mean, depending on how you look at it, you could say that this moratorium may apply or may not, depending on the context. But the bigger point really is to be mindful, and I don't know what tribes, every tribe would respond in a different way, I think also, but they do have all of these different regulations in place that could help to penalize those individuals if that's what they wanted to do.
It'd be tough until it happens the first time, though.
Right.
Let's open it up to the audience. Questions?
Hi, thank you for a wonderful panel discussion. My name is Sarah Hull. I have a joint appointment in the National Human Genome Research Institute and the Department of Bioethics at the NIH. And a question that I've had throughout the day, but this seems like a good panel to choose to ask it, the ethics of blood. I've learned a great deal about kind of the meaning of biospecimens, of parts of the human body and of remains from different Native perspectives. And I'm very cognizant of the need not to overgeneralize what I've learned about any one tribe and the meanings they bring to samples. The question that I'd like to learn more about is whether those meanings that individuals that hold in relation to their samples, whether that carries over to their views about the data that can be generated from those samples. We heard from Keolu Fox about how data are digital. They can be cut and paste and studied in very different ways than samples can once the DNA is extracted from them and put into a digitized format. And a lot of the ethical questions about the use of specimens are slightly different than the questions that come up around data, given how easy it is to share those data very broadly. And so I guess my question is, I'd be interested to hear each of your perspectives based on what you bring to the table and based on your engagement with members of Native American groups that you've talked to. Whether individuals, and whether it's individuals' views on samples that carry over to their views about data that are generated, whether that should inform our thinking about the ethics of data, or is it more, Dr. Garrison, you just made the point that you would be reluctant to share your data broadly because the information connects to not just you, but your family. And I guess that was very informative. I wonder if there are other perspectives along those lines that you can share that would help me better understand the ethics of working with data from tribal communities.
So I think that's a really challenging question because if you have tribal identifiers attached to the data, then that might be informative to the tribe, or that might be informative to people who care about that data, but at the same time it might jeopardize or it might potentially stigmatize the tribe depending on what that data are. If the tribal identifiers are removed, is that data even useful anymore? Right. We don't really know. It depends on what that is also. And I haven't really heard a lot of discussion around how data are perceived by tribes. A lot of tribes do want the results returned to them, but to dump a bunch of data on a tribe who has participated in research, they might not really do much with that, depending on what their expertise is. But as far as sharing data, I think tribes just have very different perspectives. And in the context of data sharing, there are a couple of different groups who are looking at what tribes think about data sharing. Some think that would be great and would like to have their data put into DNA repositories or dbGaP or other federal repositories, and others do not. But the tribal identifiers seems to be the big key issue that different groups are dealing with.
Yeah, I think there's two issues. I mean, I don't know. I'm just sort of hypothesizing here. It would seem that the issue of the tissue sample in the first place and the view towards the tissue sample is going to be taken care of in the beginning, right? It's going to be, at some point you have to have a tissue sample to get to the digitized thing, right? Right. So if the person's comfortable giving the tissue sample, I'm not sure that the digitization of it, I don't know what the answer is. My gut says is they don't have a problem giving the actual sample. I don't know how much problem they would have with digitizing it. I think though when you move over to that area, then you're dropping into an area that's more fraught with issues related to sovereignty and control by the communal group. So with tribes, and again, I'm going to make a broad generalization, tribes tend to be much more communal, right? All for one, all, for the most part. It's like we'll fight internally, but, don't stay out. We'll all turn and fight on you if you come in. So we have a very communal belief. And so I think that's one of the reasons why that hasn't been successful much, is once individual tribal members understand that there's a discomfort with data just being released out and shared, then tribal members become hesitant to participate. That's one of the problems with GWAS, right? And dbGaP is it's at loggerheads, because under the policies for dbGaP, if NIH funds a genetic-wide association study, that policy is pretty cut and dried, right? I mean, you have to de-identify, and those data go into dbGaP. And I know I'm really being general, because it's certainly not an area when it gets really, really technical that I understand. But dbGaP is, and this goes back to that graph I showed. dbGaP is controlled by data access committees, which tribes are told can only have federal employees on them. You saw the graph. When you go to a tribe and say, we would like you to participate in a research study, at the end of it, we want to take those data, even though they're digital, we're going to want to put them into dbGaP, and when somebody wants to come and ask for them, the people that are going to make the decision are all federal employees. At that point, the tribe is out. I mean, and I think universally, almost every tribe has said, we're out. We're not going to do that. We've had conversations with NIH about trying to change those policies or those rules, and it hasn't happened. And because of that, there are very few Native American samples in dbGaP. So that's an example of an issue that blocks tribes from being willing to participate in digital data sharing. But at the same time, if you look at other examples, if you look at something outside of the area of genetics, let's look in the area of strong heart. Right? So the strong heart study is this study that's been going on a very long time with multiple tribes, and they're collecting tissue samples. They've got tissue banks, they've got all kinds of stuff. They're doing genetic research, and they share data. Data moves from the participating research institutions to other institutions. It moves, tribes use it that are members, tribes that aren't, I think, have access. But the difference is that you say why you want to use it. It goes to the regulatory system that the tribes have bought into. It's reviewed. And if it meets all of the criteria for sharing, it's shared. And it's pretty rare, I think, and Jeff Henderson can certainly tell me if I'm wrong. He certainly knows more. But if you do that, it's rare that they don't share it. If, it makes sense. If it meets the priorities, if it meets the consents, they share it. And so it isn't that tribes are against sharing, but tribes are against sort of, the blindfold on and handing data over to someone, especially when that someone is the federal government. And whether that's fair or not, I don't want to get into an argument over it, but that it's reality because it's the perception. And that perception doesn't change. When we look at that issue, when we ask that question, it doesn't matter if we ask it to a low-income utilizer of an urban Indian health center, or we ask it of a member of the American Indian Science and Engineering, what's ASIS? I can't remember. Society.
American Indian Science and Engineering Society.
Okay. So people who are students who are studying science and engineering, you ask them that federal government question, willingness drops through the floor. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're native, it drops through the floor. And that's reality. And so, until we get to the point to where everybody is educated on what the research is and what it can be used for and what its benefit is, and the tribes are able to exert the control that they feel is their right, and I believe is their right, it's going to get complicated. And so that's why we see areas where the data sharing plan goes to NIH and the data sharing plan says, we will share, but it's at the approval of our tribal partners, and you can accept it or not. And a lot of times, NIH accepts it and funds the project. In some areas where the policies don't allow it, there's just no funding of especially GWAS studies. And Strongheart tried. I mean, I think that Strongheart did, applied for those funds and got scored well, but said, we can't put it in DB-GAP. And that's just, those two policies conflict. And so some areas genetic research is working well and data sharing works well. Other places I'm hopeful that in the future we'll get to a place where we can share.
I was actually wondering during your slides, when you mentioned at Squaxin Island, the Indian Health Service, it's all 638 in Washington State. Squaxin Island's direct service?
No, Squaxin is not direct service, but it's not 638. It's a self-governance compact.
Right.
I'm sorry, I'm a lawyer, so you can't,
Direct, where it's run by the tribe, so
right.
The perception and the identity of
right.
the Indian Health Service would be the local community.
Right. So just to explain what that is, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get all technical on you. There's healthcare delivery under Indian Health Service is delivered in two primary ways. One is through direct service, where the Indian Health Service is running the clinic or the hospital and providing service to the community. The other is either a self-governance compact or what's known as a 638 contract, where the tribe or, in some areas, a bunch of tribes, confederation tribes or other organizations, actually execute it with a contract or a compact and take those funds away from the Indian Health Service and runs it themselves. In which case, Indian Health Service has much less say over what happens and what research occurs.
Any other questions? The afternoon is set in. Here comes one.
Shio, I'm very close to this. I'm Jessica Bardill, and it's been a pleasure to hear all of these talks today, and it was also a pleasure to hear in September the symposium that was built around the African American Future Museum and its intersections with the Unlocking Life's Code exhibit. And I heard during the break some conversation about this question that I hope you guys are willing to entertain. But the title of the panel is The Ethics of Blood, and we all recognize that blood has a very loaded terminology within our communities. And so I'm wondering if you guys can talk about the difference between what Unlocking Life's Code means for Native Americans and the possibilities of genetic research in our communities when we talk about things of personal salience. What is the research that the communities are asking for, as opposed to some of the things we've seen in other communities that don't have our sovereignty?
Thank you for that question. That's a tough question, actually. I became interested in genetics because I heard all of these press conferences about the promise of genomics, how we can reduce health disparities. There was, at the time, there was not a whole lot of conversation about including Native Americans in that research, and the research that has been done has been mostly on, or a lot of it has been on diabetes research, but now we know that diabetes is far more complicated than anybody thought, and it's much more difficult to uncover genetic variants that are specific and that could be deterministic or that might be associated with type 2 diabetes. That is, type 2 diabetes is a huge health concern for tribes. But there are, so, you know, the model, the NIH and a lot of other researchers have shifted towards looking at rare genetic diseases and variants. And I think that some progress has been made there, but unlocking these secrets, I don't know how, unlocking life's code, I don't know how we're going to do it, but I think that this is a step in the right direction, and I think that Native people do want to be involved. It's just a matter of how it's done and making sure that it's done right.
And so another part of what you were discussing, Ella, you didn't say it directly, were you sort of referencing blood quantum?
Yes, and Mark started us off with that, right, by referring to the samples taken at Whitener.
Right. Yeah, so that is something also when we talk to tribal members about, that's a big concern. So for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, when the United States recognized tribes as sovereign, at the same time they also had a policy to try to remove that sovereignty from tribes and to remove Indianness from tribes. And one of the things that the Bureau of Indian Affairs did was they really encouraged what's known as blood quantums, or limitations in Indian blood to be able to be eligible members of a particular tribe. So for most, I would say the majority of tribes, I think probably the vast majority of tribes in the United States, they're within whatever usually their constitution or something, there's a quantum, which means, which they decide how much Indian blood you have to be able to be an enrolled member. So, and it varies from tribe to tribe. Cherokee Nation doesn't have a blood quantum, it has a lineal descendancy. So if you can trace back, you can be a member. My tribe, you have to be able to trace back to one of the original members of the tribe as documented by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And your total blood quantum has to be at least an 1/8 Indian in order to enroll. Yakama Nation, you have to be a minimum of a quarter blood of one of the Aboriginal bands that make up the Yakama Nation, right? So there's a bunch of differences in these things. Now the complication with genetics is that that blood quantum has been up to this point generated by family trees where it's like, all right, well this person's the father and this person's the mother, and so this child is, you know, a quarter blood, blah, blah, blah. Well, the problem is that what if the father isn't the father? Right? So that's one of the fears that a lot of tribal members have. And we see that in Indian country right now. If people heard of like the disenrollment fights that some of the tribes have had. So there's been sort of within some of the tribes, some decisions that mistakes in the quantum result in people not being eligible and then being disenrolled. So people who had grown up members of the tribe for their entire lives, all of a sudden, because of either, you know, perhaps very well be a legitimate mistake in someone's, usually father, obviously, who doesn't turn out to be their father, if that person's quantum isn't what was written down on the paper, then everybody's quantum goes down that descend from that person. And then all of a sudden there's going to be a cut line, right? And somebody under that cut line are all going to be eligible to be disenrolled. That is a really hot issue right now in Indian country and a fear amongst the tribes. Before gaming, there wasn't much reason to disenroll. I mean, it really didn't matter. But for some tribes now, if you can disenroll 15% of the tribe, your per capita payments will go up 15%. And that doesn't necessarily mean that those people aren't actually ineligible. It just has sort of become the fuel for momentum to actually disenroll people. And within communities, you know, well, you know, a lot of that, well, you know, so-and-so isn't really the father. And we see that happening where, and that's not just Indian communities, right? This is all communities. You know, it turns out sometimes that who everybody thought was the father isn't the father. But for Indian tribal members, it has a real effect. And so that's one of the issues in terms of blood that are a real concern for tribes. It's like a Pandora's box. If we go down this road of collecting samples and studying them, are we going to find out, am I going to find out that my belief that my blood quantum is an eighth from my grandfather, or from my, you know, it comes from a half-blood grandfather and a quarter-blood grandmother on my father's side? Well, if it turns out that something's wrong in my tree, am I going to get disenrolled? And that's a really legitimate fear that tribal members have, and one of the big concerns that we hear expressed.
And I just want to add to the idea of blood. There's also this common misperception that one can go out and get a genetic test, a genealogy test, or a genetic ancestry test that might be indicative, or it might tell somebody about Native American ancestry. And that's also a very hot and controversial topic. There really aren't, well, first of all, as you saw from some of the maps shown before, there is very little representation of Native American tribes in the United States and throughout the Americas, and that is mostly for political reasons that I won't go into now. But there are also there's just not enough information. Any population geneticist or any geneticist who have been looking at this information for a long time can say that there's no way that you can pinpoint what region of the world or what affiliation you have with different groups. Some studies have been done in Europe where researchers have been able to pinpoint, to some degree, with relatively higher accuracy, that a person might be of one region or one country versus another, but that data still is not indicative of any sort of membership with any sort of group or affiliation, or even might not even have any information about what country you might be from. And those studies were based on people who had all four grandparents coming from the same country. That said, there really aren't any tests out there. My colleagues and I receive emails pretty regularly asking what tests they should take in order to find out about their ancestry, but there really isn't, there's no good answer for that. And I don't know that even if science moves forward, I don't know that that will ever really be resolved.
I just wanted to piggyback on the blood quantum idea. It's a little different in Hawaii because depending on your blood quantum, you have access to resources. It's not like we don't have reservations, we have homestead land. And when your blood quantum, when you go beyond that tipping point, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs will repatriate that land. Additionally, the best school we have for high school students, the way we sort of preserve our culture, is called Kamehameha schools. It's where you learn hula, it's where you learn your language, it's where you learn everything. Again, if you don't reach the blood quantum, you don't have access to those resources, so it's hard for us to perpetuate our culture. So, this is a huge issue that I think about every day, about what we should do. And access to land, for example, like some of the most, if anybody's ever been to the Big Island of Hawaii, there's a really beautiful place on the north of the Big Island where Kamehameha was born, and there, it's, I think, 25% of what it would normally cost for any other person to buy this ranch land. If you can prove you're Hawaiian, you have access to it. So it's very strange. I'm not sure what we should do, but I was just throwing it out there because, you know, I'd like to get to the bottom of it. Thanks.
Well, no, not any good ones. I mean, especially because if I understand correctly, the Hawaiian blood quantum is pretty high too. I mean, you have to be. Yeah, you have to be really high. Right, and so if you're an eighth like me, you have to be at least an eighth. You know, for a Native Hawaiian, it doesn't take much tampering to cause a lot of problems. And that's another thing. You know, I mean, we are still sort of talking about sovereignty for Native Hawaiians through legislative action. And that's something that, you know, I'm sure the United States is going to want to keep that quantum high. At least Congress will, because the lower the quantum, the more resources they're worried it'll take. So that's a huge, that's probably right now sort of a really historic issue for Native Hawaiians. And no, I don't have a good answer for you.
Hello, I'm Nona Mapes. I can't prove I'm any Native American, but I'm not allergic to poison ivy. So I've been told that for the New England tribes, that was a distinguisher. So your last comment about not being able to identify, so all the tribes that are gone in New England then, we can't test the population of the New England area and find the remnants anywhere.
That would be very difficult to do. There is one tribe, the Seekonk Wampanoag tribe, yeah, that partnered with the National Geographic Project a couple of years ago to learn more about their genetic ancestry. And what they found was not a surprise to them. They already knew that they had a lot of mixture with African Americans and European Americans in that part of that part of the country, and so the genetic tests revealed nothing surprising to them. But I think there's just not enough information from any specific tribe or any group of people to be able to recreate any sort of genetic map of what Native Americans may have looked like if we were to look in the past. And, you know, genetics is always evolving, and our genetic code is evolving over time as with each generation, and as we pass along our genetic information to the next generation, that information will look different than the past, but there's just not enough information, I think. And even if we were talking about a majority population in that area, I think that there's just not enough information out there yet.
Okay. And I had one other question that dealt with the law. The law about remains, when they're found, they have to be returned to one of these legally recognized tribes? No. So NAGPRA really only applies to remains on federal lands or lands or that are currently held by like museums. So in the case in Montana, for instance, because those remains were found on private property, NAGPRA doesn't apply. Right. So NAGPRA is a fairly limited law. It deals with remains within on federal lands or are part of museum collections. But generally, other than that, no, you don't. And then who it's repatriated to is what was the problem, sort of the fight in Kennewick Man litigation, was, and here we see the sort of the unintended consequences of some things. I mean, genetics, you know, remember people were like, oh, this isn't even native, this is Caucasian. I mean, there's all of these sort of weird arguments that were swirling around there, which is the functional litigation. You know, I hate to take credit for it, but as part of what lawyers do is we use all the bullets that we can find, and if the lawyer's representing someone who wants to block repatriation, if there's any way that there's some sort of genetic data that I can get a hold of legally
that will bolster whatever my position is, I'm going to do everything I can to get it, and I'm going to use it, right? And that may not have been, certainly was not what was considered when those data were collected, but you get the right set of circumstances, and all of a sudden something comes out of the blue that you didn't know, and something that was done for some good reason is now turned around and is now being used against you. We see that, and and that's not, we see that with anthropological reports too. We have, in the Northwest, we have a long history of litigation between the tribes in the state of Washington and between the tribes and each other. When you have an anthropologist that's working for you that generates a report, then all of a sudden on some issue that's completely different than what was involved, all of a sudden the other side that's suing you has access to that report, and it doesn't help your current position. They're using it against you. There's all kinds of examples of that for everything, in especially litigation. And so that's one of the things that tribes are also really aware of. Just everything's a Pandora's box. Almost everything in the right set of circumstances can be turned against you. And tribes have been on the receiving end of that so many times that they're aware of it. So, yeah, that happened in Kennewickman, where genetics sort of became an argument that was used to block, successfully in that case, repatriation of those remains to the tribes in the Kennewick area.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Lauren Milner. Great talks, both of you. So I was just wondering, you were discussing how there's this huge mistrust of federal research in general. And I guess I was wondering if you have any strategies, kind of either at the policy or the funding level, where you think that could be partially amended or we could make progress. Because, I mean, I think a lot of the databases, or some of them, are federally funded. I mean, yeah, that's it.
Well, some of these funding opportunities ask researchers to build in times for them to build relationships with communities. Some of them are starting to incorporate community-based participatory research models or models like that will help researchers to actually find the time and the space to build these relationships with tribes. There was a comment earlier that it took 7 years for a researcher to begin to even get the approval from tribes to move forward with the research process. And the NIH will not fund 7 years. That's just a very long time for a researcher. But some of these program announcements are starting to build in some time for that, and also some time to do preliminary studies. There's also the Native American Research Centers for Health, the NARCH grants that do partner with tribes, and they do ask tribes to take a very large lead in these research projects. So there are opportunities out there, and I think that the NIH would be one place to go to learn more about that. There are also other agencies, or there are probably a lot of other places, but I don't know, maybe we should have somebody create a website where you can have all of that information in one place, because right now it's very hard to find those opportunities.
And the other thing I want to talk a little bit about in terms of that is that question is a super loaded question. Okay, so when we see that reaction of Native respondents with regard to the federal government, you have to also, you have to understand that the relationship between the United States federal government and the tribes is super complex and old. I mean, it went back to the very beginning of the United States. This trust responsibility that was created by the United States Supreme Court, that in exchange, I don't want to give everybody, bore them with legal lessons, but the reason why you all can own land in the United States was because of a legal fiction that the United States Supreme Court came up with called the Discovery Doctrine, that when a Christian nation discovered the United States, what's now the United States, by virtue of being Christian, that nation took title from the Indians. Title magically flowed from the Indians to the United States because the discovering country was Christian. In exchange for that, though, the United States government was vested, according to the Supreme Court, with a duty to the tribes. And so that trust responsibility is built from that point forward, where tribes have a very close relationship with the United States, a very close relationship. A bunch of funding that the tribe gets is from the United States through self-governance compacts, through 638 contracts, through direct appropriations. National Congress of American Indians has a very strong relationship with Congress. Individual tribes have very strong relationship with Congress and individual congressional representatives. They have very close relationship with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There's a lot of Indians that works for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So this, it's not like we're talking about two separate and groups that don't have any contact with each other. It's almost a love-hate relationship that the tribes have with the United States. The love of the United States to protect us, which in a lot of cases they have, especially from the individual states. But also at the same time, the push by the United States federal government to try to assimilate and kill the Indianness of the Indians, which had horrible ramifications. But at the same time, also the source of so much funding for health and other things. That relationship goes back, almost 200 years. So it's a very, very complex relationship. And so when you ask that question of an Indian, right, it's a really loaded issue. And that doesn't mean, though, that if funding comes from NIH, the tribes are going to be like, oh, no, thank you. Because the tribes get enormous amounts of funding from the United States. But it's the issues of control of who owns what, who's taking what from whom, and using it for what purpose. And how can, in the future, something that I'm doing right now for the good of my community and addressing the priorities of my community, how can that be turned around and challenge something that we as the tribal community want to do in the future? Okay. Or challenge our being an Indian, maybe even by my own tribe. Okay. So those are all of the things that swirl around that relationship.
Okay, thanks.
So it's a lot.
Thank you for your presentations today. And I just wanted to tell people that the tweets with this presentation are helping. So areas that I'm not understanding, I'm reading the tweets and they're helping. And I also wanted to acknowledge Abigail's late grandmother, Katie John. She's well known in Alaska as being one of the knowledgeable elders. And so she comes from some really great lineage. Thank you for your presentation. I'm working on my dissertation at University of Alaska Fairbanks, program Indigenous Studies, emphasis research. One of my committee members asked me how I'm going to address blood quantum. My dissertation topic is something along the lines of an examination of factors influencing the motivation and success of Alaska Native PhD graduates, a mixed method study. There are about 67, not including class of 2014, Alaska Native PhDs. That's a small number. With Native Hawaiians, there are 800 to 900. Dr. Villegas' dissertation, 500 Maoris in 5 years. That's a huge number. And with Alaska Natives, we have a smaller number, but that's still not a big number. So one of my professors, the mathematician of the group on the committee, asked how I would address blood quantum. And I'd like your advice as do you have resources that I should be looking for to do that? How I'm approaching it at this point is if they're in our, with all of our Native corporations that we have throughout Alaska, if they're a member and they're acknowledging themselves as an Alaska Native PhD or EDD graduate, these are research graduates, not MGs or JDs, but specifically PhDs or EDDs. Do you have advice of where I can search or how I can address it in my dissertation?
Are you talking about it in the context of genetics or in general?
Just in general. In my, what I'll be doing is conducting surveys, sending out surveys, and then with all of them, as many I could get back, and then interviewing about 8 to 12 of them following my survey. So I just need to acknowledge how I'm addressing them. And do you have advice as to how I can define that?
That's a great question. don't know where the best place is to address blood quantum, but there are a couple of Native scholars, one, Jessie Bardale, who is in the room, who can help to address that question. She also looked at blood quantum in her dissertation work, but looking at it from a figurative or literature perspective, which it's a very unique and interesting perspective about what storylines are like and how people tell stories and how that's translated through bloodlines as well. She might be able to point you in the direction of a couple of resources. Kim Tallbear also talks a little bit about blood quantum, not extensively, but she does talk about it a little bit in her book, Native American DNA, and that might be another resource to start with. And if there are other people who have additional resources, I think they should come up and share them with us.
Yeah, I mean, blood quantum is one of those things that I don't know where you would find it. I mean, each tribe, if you're a federally recognized tribe and you have a quantum, my tribe keeps a list of everybody's family trees and where they derive all of their Indian blood in order to calculate the quantum. But that's not publicly available. It's not reported to anybody, including to the United States, if we can avoid it. And even to the point, if you ask, if I volunteer it, good. If you ask me my blood quantum, I don't know. For me, it's a little bit of a sensitive issue that I don't, maybe it's just because of my blood quantum is obviously lower on the lower end of the spectrum that it's an issue with me. But I mean, it's a button for a lot of Native folks, and so. I wouldn't even know if you surveyed somebody and asked them. I'd be really interested to see what kind of non-answer you'd get, because my own clinic, here's a story. I went into my own health clinic at the tribe, and I'm going through the paperwork, and they asked me my quantum. And I asked, they said, why did you ask me that? I want to know why you want to collect this information. Why is my clinic collecting it? I mean, I know my enrollment office has it, and the persons are like, I don't know, it's something that the BIA wants or IHS wants. And I'm like, well, you're not going to get it, and I wouldn't answer it. And I'm generally pretty open. I mean, I'll tell you my quantum here, but if someone asks me, like in a survey, I probably won't answer it.
Yeah, I don't want to ask it, particularly given that my participants are all PhDs and EDDs, and, everyone has their opinions, and
yeah,
I think I just need to define it.
Yeah,
I don't want to ask it in my survey, but I feel like I should somehow. I need to discuss it of how I'm addressing that.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about what if any quantums are required to be members of federally recognized Alaska tribes and villages. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what quantum, if anything, there is to be a shareholder. But you could discuss those issues that surround the people that that are in your group, in your cohort, but you're not going to be able if what they're asking you to give you is what percentage have this percentage and how many have this percentage, you're not going to, I don't see any way you can get that.
This would be a very different way of approaching it, but one of my favorite metaphors comes from a book from the early 1970s called Reinventing the Enemy's Language. And in it, you take a thing like a concept like that and reshape it to fit your narrative and ignore what everything else is. And I think with blood quantum, often the shift to citizenship is something that's going on the political spectrum, certainly, as a way to contribute to the discourse. I'm afraid, well, we have one more quick one and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. About this issue with blood quantum, I think one needs to give notion to thinking of maybe handling whatever it is that's trying to be handled with collecting information on blood quantum and think about it in a little more sophisticated way. Is it a proxy for culture, acculturation? What's the use of that kind of a variable? Having said that, of 9,000 Strongheart Study tribal members, roughly half of them did tell us what their blood quantum was. But I notice I said they did tell us. In other words, they self-reported what their blood quantum was. So interesting factoid of the day is, Ron, so in the last, 16 years, there have been 6 brand newly minted federally recognized tribes, right?
I think so.
Who have to survey their membership and report statistics to the government as part of that process. Think about what you would think about the characteristics of the 6 newest minted federally recognized tribes today. What are they likely to be comprised of? The average for these 6 tribes is 80% of these newly minted tribal members declared themselves as full-bloods.
No way.
80%.
No way.
80%. What does that say, you know?
That they're liars.
So they have the benefit of being able to do self-report. You know, we who are members of tribes that have been recognized for 100-something plus years have a very long, complicated system that's well codified about how to do that. But these tribes and new tribal members had the opportunity to do that anew, fresh for themselves, and that's what they've done. And how does that speak to our notions of genetic? You know, as that gets amplified, what's that going to mean? I guess that's especially a caveat for researchers who plan to work with any of these newly federally recognized tribes. So. But thanks very much. Really, really great knockout presentations.
Thanks,
I'll let
Jeff.
that be the benediction. And thank you very much for a fabulous panel and a really remarkable day. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.